Good afternoon. I am Reverend Terrance Thomas, pastor of Bethel AME Church here in Champaign. I also sit on the board of the CU Trauma and Resiliency. And this is our Friday Lunch and Learn. First of all, thank you to Urbana Public Access Television for giving us space to have this conversation. And so today we're going to talk about the Black church. If you've been paying any attention, you know that PBS, along with Skip Gates, put out a documentary on the Black church. Sister Karen came to me and said, "Hey, can you lead a panel on the Black church?" And I said, "Absolutely, but I got some conditions. I don't do basic, and so we're not going to talk about the Black church. We're not going to talk about the Black church and with this nostalgic lens. We're going to have an honest conversation, because one of the things and goals was to talk about the future of the Black church. And I know at least one of my panelists struggles when we talk about the future. She got some different ideas. So, but I couldn't have done this with just anybody. So I looked through my Rolodex and I picked the three of my smartest ministry colleagues that are here. So let me be transparent. They are ordained, they are credentialed, they are lettered. This is not a bunch of jacklegs sitting around pontificating over coffee and Starbucks. This is a deep conversation. So I'm gonna let them tell you a little bit about what they do, but I'm gonna introduce them. First and foremost is my cousin, my friend, my accountability partner, one of the smartest, wisest reverends I know, Reverend Naomi Washington-Leapheart. Also joining us today is soon to be Reverend Dr. Kyle Brooks. And then lastly, who will come in a little bit later, is Reverend Dr. Jamie Eaddy. And so real quick, Naomi, in a minute, tell the people what you do so they'll know who you are and who's speaking.
Thank you, cousin. I'm Naomi Washington-Leapheart. I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I work as part of city government as the director for faith-based and interfaith affairs. And I teach theology in the Theology and Religious Studies department at Villanova University in suburban Philadelphia. So I am interested in how faith gets worked out in the public square, in the political square, and how faith forms the classroom, forms and informs the classroom. So I'm happy to be part of this conversation.
Indeed. Reverend Kyle, you have the floor. Tell us a little bit about you.
Greetings, everyone. Kyle Brooks. I am the assistant professor of homiletics, worship, Black church, and African diaspora studies at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio. My work really centers around religion, rhetoric, communication, and Black studies. And as a teacher and trainer of persons entering into ministerial work, but also various other realms of theological education and life in the public square, I'm really concerned with how we recognize the power of language and communication and shaping and framing our institutions, our organizations, and our work in the broader world.
All right. And when she hops on, Reverend Dr. Jamie is a doula. She's a chaplain. She does in spiritual care, how we minister to people in the midst of crisis. And so let's get to it while we're here. As I indicated in the beginning, when this conversation started, cousins, one of my favorite books, y'all know I love Star Wars. And so one of my favorite books is the actual novelization of Revenge of the Sith. And in it, Yoda's having this epiphany, as you saw the movie, him and Sidious are fighting. And he said, we spent a generation training Jedi to fight the last war, unaware of the evils present to us now. And that's how I see a lot of Black institutions, in particular the church. We spend so much time training to fight wars and battles of the past. And so when we talk about the Black church, that's what I want us to keep in mind. Let's talk about what we need to do to be in the 21st century. Let's talk about what we need to do to move ahead so we can break some chains, so we can elevate and correct some things. So let's kick it off. What did you all think of the documentary, The Black Church? Kyle, what did you think of it? Speak truth to power.
All right. Well, to briefly speak to it, I think the documentary was a reflection of the competing interests of the preservers, historians, and practitioners, and the departed of the Black church, or what we call the Black churches. I I think there were certainly some areas of exploration that were not delved into as deeply as one could, but um, part of the challenge is I think it's an enterprise that from the beginning has to presume certain limitations and shortcomings. 4 hours is not enough time to tell that story or that collective of stories in a robust and meaningful way that will also be true to something more than nostalgia. And I think, and if I had to distill it, I think fundamentally the documentary for me raised what I think is a critical issue for the Black church, its life and history, but also its potential futures. Namely, too much of the discussion around the Black church and imagination and understanding of its histories is caught between the axes of critical memory and nostalgia. And nostalgia will never allow us to see and to make the sort of difficult ethical evaluations we have to make of what has been a powerful and also provisional institutional emergence. I also think, and I'll stop it with this, that it also was a reminder to me that anything that we begin to understand as an institution also has adopted a measure of institutional logics. So what do institutions privilege as the necessary practices for maintaining themselves, for staying in existence? And who benefits from the way that this account of the Black church is being told and being expressed?
Okay. Cuz, you up?
Yeah, I agree with what Kyle is saying, and I would say that um, one of the things that I guess troubled me as I was watching was that Black church was framed over and against white folk. So while there's a tension here, I understand that there's a way in which the Black church, big B, big C, emerged from the experience of chattel enslavement, the experience of oppression, segregation, discrimination, death. And I want to know why we are stuck identifying ourselves in relationship to what white folk are doing to us and around us. Um, and, you know, when we talk about 21st century Black church, I think that that church, whatever church is emerging for the future, needs to be concerned with articulating itself and determining itself in spite of and regardless of white folk. What are Black futures that are wholly unbothered and unconcerned by and unhampered by, unencumbered by white folks? And I think as long as we continue to define ourselves in that relationship, in that traumatic relationship, we won't be able to explore all of the possibilities of Blackness. So I just wonder, you know, how we can. Again, it begs the question: who was this made for? Was it made for folk who don't understand us to understand us? In which case, maybe I wasn't the primary audience in mind. So that's what's on my mind. You know, I did get swept up in what Kyle is rightly naming as nostalgia, right? You know, I did get caught up in the sounds and the sights that the documentary helped me to remember. And so it made me feel proud and good that those sounds and those sights come from people who look like me. So I will say that it was a powerful uh, sort of embodied experience for me to sway with the people I was looking at swaying to sing what they were singing, to finish their sentences and anticipate their cadences, right? That made me feel proud of what this institution has been and continues to be. But yeah, I had a lot of questions that hopefully, will be explored maybe in other iterations of telling our story.
Indeed. Now it's interesting, as both of you know, I didn't come from the Black church tradition. I grew up Jehovah's Witness from through and through. So in many aspects, I've always viewed it from a distance. Even sometimes even being in it is this distance. It feels like, and I've always looked at it through the lens of through a political entity, through my time in African American studies, and a cultural vehicle. And I have to agree with your assessments because it's I would like for Black folks in totality, but since we're talking about the church, to get to a place where we're no longer identifying ourselves over and against whiteness, over and against how we were done, or that's a critical part of the story, but there's more to who we are. And so everything we talk about, it has to be this juxtaposition. And can we just stand in authentic Blackness regardless of what happens? Uh, I'm also very skeptical of the work of Skip Gates. I know he tells wonderful stories for others to explain our worldview, and so for me, I'm curious as to what was left on the cutting floor, because we're familiar with almost all of those scholars that were on there on some level or another, and I'm almost certain there was some real fire spit and left on the floor. But you take us into our next question. So we're moving out of this nostalgia that Kyle talked about. Everybody's had this picnic and remembered the good times, et cetera. And then when we looked outside our doors the next morning, we're still living in the 21st century. So what does the Black church need to do now to either establish power or regain its power that it once had in this present time? Go ahead, Nay.
Well, I think that the Black church, have to really honestly and thoroughly answer the question, who who are we trying to be? I mean, you know, to Kyle's point, the church as an institution has been a provider of providers, has been able to stand in the gap when the system disregarded us. And I think that's good. I think that's good. I think a question is, will we continue in the 21st century to be a charitable organization and a charitable organization only? Because here's the thing about being a charitable organization: you only exist when there is lack and need.
Mm.
Your bread is buttered by the poverty around you. And so, you know, when I was in more traditionally nonprofit organizations and then dipped my toe in philanthropy, and particularly equitable philanthropy, one of the things that I would hear all the time was, we need to work ourselves out of business.
Mm.
I was hearing these philanthropists say, I want to make sure that there's no need for someone to amass wealth as I have done, and then create a dynamic where people are dependent on my benevolence to have their basic needs met, right? And so I wonder whether we've developed a codependent kind of relationship with our own folk, that, we in a pandemic, well, the church will provide, or we're in as opposed to the church asking critical questions about the conditions within which we live, such that we want to eradicate those conditions. But that means we have to actually want to be something other than or beyond a traditional charitable organization. And so, I think that's one question we have to ask. Do we exist to continue to stand in gaps and meet the needs only? Or do we exist to radically transform the conditions within which we live? Which means that some of the things that we are so tethered to as organizations. Some of these ministries, some of these would necessarily go away. But with that would be a radical loss of identity, I think, for folks. And so we're holding on to the ways we can have power over people by keeping them in need of us, right? When the gospel is not about creating a dependency on me, right? And so I think that's one question we have to continue to ask if we want to continue to have life beyond this moment.
Indeed. Kyle, Cuz brought up something that I thought she just said something great. What are some of the questions in your mind that should the Black church in the 21st century be asking? To piggyback off of Reverend Naomi's comments, what are some of the questions in your sanctified imagination, as they like to say, that we should be raising up?
So one powerful question that comes to mind from something that Reverend Naomi mentioned is that feeling of you felt that sense of the swaying with and what it meant to be brought back to these sounds, to these feelings, to these emotions. And there's something there, something that's generative. And knowing you in the way that I do, I know we share certain understandings and knowledge of what those Black church spaces and Black Pentecostal spaces meant for us, and how we are the thinkers and creators and imaginers that we are now because of that. And we are also dealing with the complex consequences of those spaces in tension, the ways that they were not necessarily prepared to hold various pieces of our lives and our interests and our being. And so part of what I think has to be worked out is much in the way that children, as they develop and grow into adults, come to terms with the very humanness of the persons who produced them and raised them and shaped them, is we have to have that same kind of analysis of our very lineage. I think we have to ask critically, I guess, to distill it into some pointed questions. One, we have to ask if our commitment to the Black church is fundamentally an aesthetic fixation, or is it an attachment to a tradition of radical transformation? Related to that too, if we say that, oh, well, it's not just about the, as church folk would say when I was growing up, we didn't come here for form or for fashion. So if we are not participating in this thing we call the Black church for form or fashion, for performance, or simply creative expression, but for radical transformation, then we have to critically ask how radical transformation is antithetical, is oppositional, is contradictory to certain logics of institutional preservation. So if the idea is we want to hold on to what we got, and what we think we got is shrouded in the lens of nostalgia, not critical memory, because I'm like, if my nostalgia says, hey, I remember the days when, my Black church, my Black Pentecostal congregation felt like family. There were folk who, for me, and this is me, speaking of my experience, growing up, families in the church who like would have me and my brothers over for the weekend and feed us and take care of us and take us places, right? Like a real familial atmosphere, right? And within that same church, I also remember like being a kid sitting in the pew and watching like a teenage girl brought up before the church to give account for her pregnancy, which was, as far as I know, not an immaculate conception, but the Negro involved in that process was nowhere to be seen and never spoken of, right? So there's I think dealing with the complexity of how these spaces are both very generative as places of refuge, but also if they're going to be radically transformative, there's some stuff we gotta, if you want to fly, you gotta let go of some of the stuff that's weighing you down. And you can't understand and diagnose what's weighing you down until you really account for who have we become as a result of these spaces, and what actually is the thread, is the DNA of this longer tradition that's worth preserving and worth reimagining in a new phenotype, because it can't look and feel exactly like the thing we had before.
Indeed. I see Dr. Jamie's in studio, so when she's ready to come on camera, Doctor, welcome. Uh, uh, Dr. Jamie, I kind of introduced you, chaplain extraordinaire, doula extraordinaire. We are talking about the Black church. Thank you for joining us. I know your schedule is tight. And so one of the conversation is, what are some of the things, and I'm gonna tailor it specifically to your field, the 21st century. What does spiritual care look like for the Black church? Because one of my theories is we lost two generations because we didn't know how to deal with trauma. So we lost the babies of the 80s and 90s. We're losing them now because we don't know how to minister to trauma and death. And I can't tell you how many people told me, I lost my mom, my aunt so-and-so. Pastor told me that was God's will. I stopped coming to church the next Sunday. And so is that something, one of those weighty things that Kyle talked about that we got to let go? You got the floor. I'm throwing you right in the hot seat.
Yeah, well, first of all, we stop saying that. Anybody who's listening, like, stop saying that. I think that's one of the worst things that we can say to people. One, we really just don't know the mind of God. We really don't. Like, we can imagine and we can hope, but we don't know. All of what we are doing is, even with our critical thinking and our imagining, we don't know. So I would never tell somebody that it was God's will that their loved one not be here. And whether that was their loved one lived for 90 years and died in their sleep peacefully, or that was their loved one was in a car accident. And like, that's just not something that I say to people. So when I think we need to figure out a way to reimagine our language around death. We need to find a way to talk about death. We talk about being a people, a resurrection people, and so believing that there is something after death, that there is some way that we live on, which I do believe. So even as I talk about people dying or losing the people who are here with us physically, I don't believe that people are lost, that they're in some way that somebody is always with us, whether by memory or spirit, that people are here. I still talk to people. Like, I talk to Toni Morrison when I'm trying to write. And like, she's not here with me, but I talk to her, believing that her spirit is in this space with me as I'm writing, right? So I believe that ancestors are always around us. So finding a different way to talk about death, to talk about ancestors, to talk about spirit, that's one thing. The second thing is we got to find a better way to listen, because we just don't listen in church spaces, in spaces where we claim to want people to be healed. And part of healing is to give people space to share their story, to share their narrative, unsanitized and raw. And so I need you to be able to come and to cry and cuss and fuss and to name, which means naming your loss. And if that loss is, let's talk about some of the ambiguous losses, right? The losses that we don't really talk about, the loss that maybe you ain't even think I was supposed to be with the person, but I lost them anyway. Like, to be able to come and name the loss that you you don't think I should name. The loss that you deem as bad, that whatever it is, we need to give people space for naming, and to have empathy, which is not to fix the situation, which is not to tell people that this was God's will, that they are going to be stronger. I think that there are some losses that alter our lives forever, and that there is no scripture that you will give me that will fix my situation. You can help me learn ways to live with this loss, but you're really not going to fix it. So I think we just need to figure out ways to change language, to reimagine language, to talk about death, because the truth is, it is inevitable. And things die every day, not necessarily people, as Reverend Naomi talked about. We don't want to see any more people slain, but there is some ish that needs to die. In us and around us, there's some stuff that needs to die, and we can talk about and reimagine what needs to live in us so that we can live. And I think that's how we start to have that spiritual care conversation. What needs to live? How can we imagine what thriving and healthy living looks like? How can we imagine what it means to see people, not as you hope them to be, not as you want them to be, not as you deem them good, like, but what does it look like to see people in all of what makes them them. What does it mean to be and to be seen as you, as God has created you, whether you are Christian or not, however you come to the faith or not? I think that's how we start that spiritual care conversation. And then to recognize that we have all experienced trauma, and to not wash that trauma under the rug and to pretend it doesn't exist and to think we can pray the trauma away. Trauma is real, and trauma requires more than prayer. Like, I'm a woman of prayer. I believe in prayer, but some of this stuff requires prescription. Some of this stuff requires talk therapy. Some of this stuff requires killing some stuff that we have been trying to hold on to, whether in our homes or in our churches, for way too long. So when we talk about trauma, it's more than just sitting in the church and crying. Now, don't get me wrong. There is something very therapeutic about yelling and movement and getting stuff out of our bodies, but we also need to look at the other side as well. So I guess that's where
No, and you called up perfect. So here's what I'm thinking though. You all name some things. Is it possible to do that? Now I'm gonna drive down your block, Naomi, without divorcing or abolishing Christianity as we know it? Because everything you all named, I agree with 110%. But I'm thinking folks still got Lifeway Bible study material. Folks still read off the Christian Post. Folks still eat fast food theology. And so, will this require a divestment of sorts from Christianity as we know it? Is this one of those moments where, to quote our Nation of Islam brothers and sisters, we got to separate, right? We got to figure out a way to intentionally separate. So, Naomi, kick it off for me.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that a gardener knows, right, that to continue to cultivate healthy growth, to keep plants alive, you got to do some periodic pruning and weeding, which means sometimes you have to cut off parts of the plant that you want to grow.
I'm from the north. I don't know nothing about gardening.
You know about
You gotta do it with your hair.
Detroit is,
hair.
Trim those ends, right? That to lose, this is how we've gotten caught up, right, in the myth of white America. Because there's a narrative around winning and losing that we have totally subscribed to, right? That winning is the only laudable outcome, and winning by hook and crook, winning by any means necessary,
and blowouts.
Yes, it's not, you got to trounce on your opposition, right? And that losing is shameful, that needing help and vulnerability, not being able to do it by yourself, is shameful, right? And so we, let that go, because that ain't serving America well, first of all, and it certainly doesn't serve us. It's not where that's not what naturally runs through our veins, or through our ancestral line, right? This rugged individualism, right? So yes, I think that as Alice Walker wrote, sometimes we need to separate for health. We do. We need to say, I'm gonna press pause on this. Let me be restored to wholeness, so that I can come back and look at this with healthier eyes, perhaps, right? And recognize that sometimes pruning is necessary for growth. There might be parts of our own plant that have strangled us, that are strangling us. I preached a sermon once on this notion of heart rot, right? So my grandmother was a gardener, and so I ain't a gardener, but I learned whatever I know about gardening from my grandmother, who was nurturing and birthing us in Detroit, but that's up south. So she had that southern. And there was a tree in my grandmother's backyard that was dying.
Okay.
And so she called the tree people, who told her that the tree was suffering from heart rot. This disease where the tree is dying from the inside out. So looking at the tree, you're like, oh, that's a good tree. But there's something going on the inside. And if you ignore the little signs that something's wrong on the inside, by the time you see that the tree is dying, it's too late to save, right? And so I think we have so much to learn from all God's creation about what it means to be alive and stay alive. So, abolish doesn't need to be a bad word. That separation doesn't need to be a bad word. We're not abandoning this thing that birthed us. But as Kyle said in the beginning, we got to rearrange this, renegotiate this relationship. Once you get good and grown, you are not in the same kind of relationship with the people who birthed you and raised you, right? And if you don't make that shift, it's going to be hard. And so, I am that one who is on a break. We on a trial separation or something. While I articulate, figure out for myself how I will be faithful. But that doesn't mean that I have abandoned the very place that nurtured me. Even as the church is the site of my deepest trauma, right? It is also the site of my deepest growth. It makes me thoroughly. My shadow parts and my radiant parts, right? So I haven't abandoned it. But I do believe that people need to figure out, negotiate the relationship for themselves and not be coerced into something that doesn't serve you well.
Indeed, indeed. Same question, Kyle. In the light of all of this, because and again, that's one of the things I push even as pastor. One of the things you'll hear me talk about is we got to figure out a way to get this, shake off this evangelical kind of white supremacist mindset, and it's hard because this is what people have been used to eating. It's almost like 50 years I've been eating this. Now you telling me it's killing you, and I'm like, look on the inside though. And so, does the Black church need to separate, like really, really, however that looks, from the rest of Christianity to do this reset we talking about?
Man, I mean, so part of that, I think, yes, I do think there's a kind of separation that has to occur, and it's going to be somewhat painful. Immediately, what comes to mind for me is that the institution or institutions we understand as the Black church in this present moment and day are thoroughly entangled with a Western American imagination of the world, a Western American theological imagination. And this, I come back to Willie James Jennings and his text, The Christian Imagination, and where he deals with this problem of how Christianity's sort of socialization processes not only create and maintain these segregated spheres. We can name the ways in which the Black church in its nascence, in some respects, is responding to a kind of pervasive white supremacist entity. But also, we have to reckon with how that entity and its theological view of the world are also wrapped up in so much of how we end up doing church. And so we end up not interrogating, and I'll tell you, I've had these sort of weird conversations with people who are in such a rush to either like decry the significance of cultural particularity, right? Like in favor of a sort of theological universalism. And this is, I've gotten this from a lot of Black folk, right, who would probably identify as more theologically conservative. I've also gotten it from a lot of well-meaning white folk who will, the kind of folk who always address me as a brother and sister in Christ, but never is just like brother and sister or like neighbor, right? So everything needs to be framed in this kind of theological construct that holds us together, because socially, politically, economically, every other way, you ain't really trying to rock with me like that. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of Black folk ain't trying to rock with other Black folk like that either. right? So in this, so in light of the kind of winning and the cultural construct of winning that, Naomi named so well, folk are often looking for this way to hold on to the best aesthetics and feelings and feel good stuff of the Black church, while also still striving for a kind of position and status within an American cultural hierarchy. And my thing is, those things can't really coexist, or rather, if they do, all you're doing is putting a Black churchy aesthetic on top of a fundamentally like socially, politically, and theologically corrupt and inept structure. So I think people got to ask themselves, like, what do you actually want? Is everybody talking about the day of the Lord? It's like, do you actually know what that is, what that looks like? What does that mean for the stuff you got to give up and let go? And I say that as like, a lettered person, a person with certain kinds of access to privileged positions within Black church structures, right? Like if I wanted to be like that person, if I wanted to be out on this circuit or, hobnobbing with these folk, right? Like I know that there are mechanisms that are possible for all of this, but unless people are really willing to commit to the difficult work that makes the Black church a flourishing place for all who would come, I'm like, we gonna find ourselves having these same conversations every, year, 5 years, 10 years. And I don't care, what your stripe is, whether you further on the conservative end or like much more progressive theologically, whatever the case may be. Everybody likes being comfortable. And growth is only going to happen if we can have uncomfortable, honest conversations around like, well, what do we want this thing to be? Who do we want it to serve? Because like too much of it for me, and this is the rhetorician in me comes back to like how our language is a container for the things we truly believe and hold dearly. But as well, how this thing we call the Black church, to me, yeah, it's got roots in African deep thought, but it also is not a thing that can't be clipped off from that root and planted in a Western American theological soil that we imagine is neutral, but that has its own kinds of interests and concerns.
I've often argued, and I'm gonna get to you, Doc, that it dawned on me one day when somebody at church I was visiting was talking about blessed and highly favored. And I had heard it 1,000 times over, but in that moment, it felt so capitalistic to me, right? Like there's this class system in the kingdom of God. And that's where I began to, even when I engage Christians now, this faith in this inception was intended to be communal. So where this individualism come in at, when I would talk to the people in my church, I use language they understand. I mean, this is what we have. You can have a nice house on a dilapidated block, but according to the rules, you don't have a nice house because everything around you is messed up. And so how do we build up together to stretch that? And so I guess for me, when I'm hearing the way I hear it explained, Jamie, is I hear double consciousness, I hear double-mindedness, but also hear cognitive dissonance. And so what's the impact of that? Because now we asking people, we asking Big Mama to stop saying favor ain't fair. Like it's does that create, how do we minister to people through these transitions? As a pastor, how do I minister to people?
Right. So that's so first of all, the blessed and highly favored, those kinds of conversations, because we say that, right? We say that, and that, but we're able to have those kinds of conversations with people when we get honest from the pulpit and really talk about what when you look at the text that talks about who is favored, like let's get real about what the text says. When that favored text, let's read all into who that person is. Let's look at that life. What does that favorite life look like, right? What does that favorite life look like? Because when we talk about that blessed and highly favored of the Lord, what does the rest of that life look like? Like, where does that person end up? So we use, even the way we use some of these cliche sayings, right? They don't even equal what the text says for us. We've taken it and we've made it this really pretty, blessed and highly favored, probably for most equals a car and some houses. It equals something that's really aesthetically beautiful. But that person's life in the text, the person's life for the text that says that that person is blessed and highly favored of the Lord, that life doesn't translate to the life that we are claiming for blessed and highly favored. So having those kinds of conversations with people, it takes some time. But I want to go back to what Kyle talked about, trying to hold on to the both and. But we're doing it with our own lives as well. It's that grieving process, right? It is, I know that I should not, it's I know that I need to move from this space to something else. I know that there's some stuff I need to let go of, but this place of comfort, I want to sit here because I'm comfortable. And you ask me to let go of a whole lot of stuff. And man, I don't know what that's going to be like over there. And the truth is, I ain't ready for it. I'm not doing the work in my own life. And you're asking me to do a work with a community. That's really what we're asking people to do. We're asking people who, and this is not like, we're asking people who are, we don't know how to do grief in our own lives yet. We don't know how to let go of, we don't know how to let go of trauma or to move through trauma. We haven't worked through that in our own lives. And we're looking for this community letting go of for what is different. I don't know how we do that, to be quite honest. I don't know how we get pastors to move from point A to point B, because that's where the work is needed. I don't know that it's all the congregation that isn't getting it. I think some of the congregation does get it. I think in some cases, it might be leadership in many cases that is holding on more. I think Big Mama can get it. I think in some cases, Big Mama might understand it if you sit down and talk with Big Mama a little bit and help Big Mama understand how this is equal to this. I think Big Mama might be able to get it if we take our time and have the conversation. I think sometimes that the issue is who's leading the congregation and not necessarily always the congregation. And let me say, that's been my experience. My experience is not that the congregation doesn't want help seeing what the possibilities all the time. My experience has been that often the leadership of the congregation is saying, you know, my people ain't ready for this. Yes. And therefore I'm not going to present new information that might make people question or wonder or be curious. We would rather say that we know that we know that we know, rather than be curious of possibilities of living in another way, of experiencing something new.
Go ahead,
Kyle, because you look like you're ready.
You put your finger on something. That leadership piece is key. And I'll be the first to admit, like, as a person who has pastored, right? Like, I have sympathy for the particular challenges that emerge in trying to do that leadership well. I also know I've been around enough leaders who will pay lip service to the kinds of transformative things they want to see happen, but then it will hit you with the Heisman real quick the moment you introduce something that don't quite jive with what's comfortable, right? Mm-hmm. So as a person who I know there's plenty of pastors who know me, who know I teach preachers, right? And I teach them preaching. And we'll say to folk like, oh yeah, he gonna help your pastor with his preaching. Like, no, I'm not, because you don't want that. you wanna sound like, you want to have the tinkling cymbals and sounding brass of progressive ideas without actually having to like turn anything over. And so there's this tension in which like the Black church cannot be a thing in the world that it is not within its own confines. Right. So if you're a fundamentally anti-democratic, autocratic kind of space within the walls of your church, how in the world do you want the church to be a radical, transformative presence in the midst of a culture that you have already assimilated and cast your lot with?
Right.
You know, it's funny because as pastor, both of you said something, and I'm gonna let you. I hear that from colleagues so often. I can't, man, you teaching that stuff? Well, one, what the hell did I go to school for? Like, I got debt for this. It's like going to law school, medical school, accounting, and then be like, I'm gonna still count the beans. Like, no, there was, so we do need to talk about it. That's on the whole nother panel, pastors and folks that go to seminary for the checklist, but come out literally the same way. I heard
Doing
somebody
the
say that
same
once a year.
thing, doing the same thing,
Yeah, somebody said
doing
that
the
to me a
exact
year at
same thing.
graduation. I came out the same way I came in, and I didn't even have like, wow, don't
It's a waste of time.
don't ruin the celebration. Like some of
Right.
us got transformed. Uh, go ahead, Nate, hop in there. You about to say something?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say we also make people pay for telling the truth, right? So there is this way that
That's it.
folk on the one hand in leadership are trying to preserve and protect a certain kind of autonomy, a certain kind of
You right about
mythic, heroic leadership where you're the mysterious one who knows all and is good, that everybody else don't know as much as you do, and all of that. But on the other hand, we will make people suffer
that's true.
behind trying to disrupt what is harming us and usher in something that is full of possibility, like Jamie is talking about. And so I also want us to take care of our prophets.
Yeah,
I want us to take care of those who say, I will be courageous, I will be I will take the risk, I will be vulnerable in leadership.
Mhm.
But what we do is we drag those folks and we exile those folks and we, further isolate those folks. And so what incentive does anybody have
Mhm.
to tell the truth, to shame the devil, right? I mean, there's a personal pride, there's a
Yeah.
personal sense of integrity, but like we don't pay people, we don't, and so I need us to act like we actually want the prophetic by nurturing and preserving and taking care of our prophets.
And,
Yeah.
and real talk, that was my struggle in even putting this panel together. I need folks that's going to tell the truth, not give the Heisman the lip service to being progressive. I'm about to cry because when you talk about the isolation and the pushing away, it's very lonely in my context because everybody gives lip service to radical thought, etc. But when the dude with the purple rope come in, all that goes out the window, and so then you become the jerk that in the room because so like that old thing, we first person speak of it, we all gonna stand up and you stand up and everybody sitting down like this. And so it does get lonely. We punish people. People stop tithing. I know for a fact folks have stopped tithing at my church because I refuse to teach the Bible as inerrant and infallible. And so you withhold resources. People badmouth you, folks. So to your point, uh, we don't protect the prophets. We don't protect the people that tell the truth. Even in the congregation, we run out folks that speak truth to power. God forbid if somebody raise a challenge against the pastor that's grounded in truth and justice. Oh, they might as well find a new church. So I thank you for lifting that up. That it's a very dangerous construct. Because yeah, it's not, liberation is for real. It ain't free, and there's a cost. But I find that a lot of folks want a diet liberation. They want the taste of liberation without, actually having to do any of the work. So in our final 7 minutes, I'm actually we moving into the 21st century. You gave strategies. If you had a room full of how many black clergy, what would be your message and workshop you would teach to help them bring to the 21st century? You got full reign, all things being equal now. I hear you, and can't nobody run you out with pitchforks. You got them there. What would you say? What would you say to the room, me and my colleagues? Go ahead, Kyle, kick it off for me.
Man, so given the way that I think language is an important container for our belief, our thought, our storytelling, I would really deal with some of the critical history and underpinnings of this thing we call Black preaching.
Okay.
And I would also deal with the gendered and sexualized ramifications of the pulpit and what it means to be a communicator in and from these spaces. Because part of what folks think is just this neutral preaching of the gospel, I'm like, it is bound up in very material, very fleshly concerns. There's reasons why folk, you get a bunch of young preachers trying to sound like, gravelly voiced old men from a pulpit, right? Because they want to evoke a kind of consciousness, a kind of aesthetic that suggests to people this is authoritative, this is meaningful, this is powerful. And along with that, I would really want folks to dig into how much of what you think constitutes meaningful preaching and a meaningful communication of gospel is grounded in aesthetics fixations. You want to sound like this person, you want to look like this thing, you want to chase relevancy as a primary goal rather than understanding relevancy as a consequence or a side effect of meaningful communication. And so I think that's where I would go, because as many folk, as center their understanding of Black church life, right, and worship and liturgy around the preached word and also the embodied persons who communicate it, I would say, if we can disambiguate some of the stuff going on there and really be honest about the fact that, like, in a lot of respects, with our preachers, our leaders, our communicators, we have been chasing ghosts. And we got to be able and willing to exercise those ghosts in order to let, the new wine live in a new wineskin. So, like, stop trying to sound like MLK circa 1962. Stop trying to, you're not the next Gardner Taylor. Right. We don't need, like, we need to understand them not as exemplars for all time, but as provisional responses to the circumstances of their moment, so that we understand how to provisionally respond to our moment. And I don't mean drag a kiddie pool onto the stage or wear skinny jeans or embody every other, like, cultural thing you see that looks cool and interesting. I'm sorry, I'm rambling on, but, like, I feel a way about it, So,
but no, that's your thing, and that's why, like I said, each one of you all were asked for a reason. So I thank you for that. Jamie, you got X number of Black preachers in the room. The show seminar. We go into the 21st century. What you teaching them?
I'm probably going into the trauma space, the trauma and the grief and language space. I think one, we are carrying a lot of trauma and we are bleeding that onto our congregations, onto our families and our communities. So I'm probably sticking into that space, looking at self-awareness, because the folks who are bleeding all of the trauma onto their congregations are, Terrance, CPE, right? Very unaware of how we use language, of what happens when we use language, everything of what Kyle just said, right? So I'm sticking with the trauma piece, the grief piece. I want to get into the emotion, and I want to get into the emotional space with folks, because I want to figure out how to integrate mental and emotional health into our spirituality, so that we can be whole beings and not kind of put that on the shelf and try to step into the sanctuaries as this sort of spiritual person who is preaching to people and abusing people at the same time, because we haven't dealt with all of the trauma and stuff that we have, that has occurred since childhood, that we have also inflicted on our families and our congregations. So I'm probably going to stick with the trauma space and deal with self-awareness and trauma.
Okay. All right, cuz you got the room, you got the whiteboard. I seen you present, so you got your stuff. You ready? You got your movie references, your comic book references. What you bringing to the preachers?
I want to curate a space that can cultivate bravery. I mean, I think what we are seeing is not only a failure of imagination, Kyle's talking about, not only kind of a trauma response like Jamie's talking about, but like a lack of moral courage. And that must mean that we don't have many opportunities. We avoid opportunities to be brave.
Okay.
Right? This is what's comfortable, what we've been talking about all hour. And so how can we create the conditions within which people are invited, summoned to be brave, right? I think a lot about this. Can courage be like cultivated and manufactured? Like, can we, you know what I mean? I mean, can we take someone who's been doing this for 35 years the same way, and create the conditions within which they can learn to be brave. They can take risks, right? Um, and so maybe I would ask the preachers, the pastors. There was a meme or a graphic going around social media. What would you do if you weren't afraid, right? So I would say, who would you be if you weren't afraid? What would you do if you weren't afraid? If we can be brave enough to admit that to ourselves and admit that to each other, and then continue to create these spaces. Because I get that people ain't gonna be, you know, saying focus abominations and doing this and that on Monday, and then on Tuesday I get that. I get that. So how do we create the pathways and the processes that help people, strengthen their bravery, their courage muscle, so that's what I would, if I had some time, I would want people to experience a little bit of what it means to be brave. And that it's not scary. Nobody died. Nobody, you know, and little by little, we will become as courageous as we need to be to transform ourselves and the world.
Indeed, indeed. I think we just hit the 4 o'clock time, so I want to thank you all for an engaging hour together. Three of my closest friends in the world. I thank you. Uh, Jamie since Princeton, Naomi since seminary, Princeton, Kyle, we unfit, man. I appreciate you, all what you do. Real quick, though, this is Urbana, Champaign Urbana. Folks gonna want to find you. I already know that somebody gonna look at this and you said something. Where can the people find you? Jamie, go ahead.
Thoughtfultransitions.org.
Thoughtfultransitions.org. All right, that's easy peasy. Cousin, where can the people find you?
That's me. I'm looking at Kyle
Yeah.
like, why Kyle not saying nothing? It's terrible. It's been a
I
long
was
day.
waiting on you, sis.
You can email me at hello Reverend Naomi. Hello REV Naomi at gmail.com. And I'm also at Oh Holy Shift. Spell it right. Oh Holy Shift on Instagram and Twitter.
Amen. Amen. And my future preaching coach, Dr. Cal, where can the people
Yes,
find
yes. So you can find me on Twitter at the Nubian Prince. That's THA Nubian Prince. There's a story behind the name. Don't worry about that. That's on Twitter. On Instagram, Keelay All Day. That's KeeLayAllday. That's Instagram. And you can also catch me, look me up, Kyle Brooks, Methodist Theological School in Ohio. You can find my email and stuff there if you really got to hit me up. But yeah, I'm out here on these streets, so I'll let your boy.
Indeed. I'm such a Gen Xer. I don't even know how to find Kyle. Wow, I'm officially that old. Like, I wouldn't even know how to find you. I saw me and Jamie facing Gen Xers. We like,
Don't call Gen Xers old.
we turned. All right, you know where to find me, Bethel AME, every 9:30. Every Sunday we broadcast, and every Tuesday at 5 o'clock. Check the Facebook page for the Zoom information. We're gonna get out of here. City Urbana, you can kill a broadcast. Thank you so much. I appreciate each and every one of you. God bless.